There is a kind of happiness that arrives quietly, almost without permission. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with fanfare or with music. It just settles in, the way light settles into a room when the curtains are opened in the morning, steady and warm and almost embarrassing in its ordinariness. This was the happiness Steve Rogers found himself carrying in the months after Washington, after the Triskelion, after the long search for a man with winter in his eyes, who might, somewhere beneath all that damage, still be his best friend. The search was ongoing. The wounds were not healed, but Steve had a team again, and purpose again, and something that felt, tentatively, cautiously, like home. The Avengers, Tower 93 floors above Manhattan, and everything that came with it. The training rooms and the briefing rooms, and the common areas where people wandered in at odd hours and left half-eaten things in the refrigerator and argued about music. It was, in its way, the closest thing Steve had had to a household since the flat in Hell's Kitchen. And if some part of him never stopped listening for Bucky's footstep on the stair, or for Sam's voice coming down the corridor with news from the search, well, that was his private weather. He kept it private. He learned how. And then there was one particular evening. Let yourself picture the tower from the outside first, lit from within, high above the city, the windows warm and amber against the cold December sky. And inside, the lights are low, and someone has put music on. And the team, these improbable, impossible people, are together in a way that doesn't happen often. Tony Stark, still in his shirt sleeves, gesturing broadly about something. Thor, fast and golden and entirely at ease, like a son that has decided to take a chair. Clint Barton, nursing a drink, watching the room with the particular patience of a man who notices everything. Natasha, sitting sideways on a couch, her feet on the cushion, her expression doing the thing it always does. Warm when you catch it at the right angle, inscrutable from the front. Bruce Banner laughing at something, genuinely laughing, the kind of laugh that comes out of people only when they have stopped being afraid for long enough to remember they are capable of it. And Steve Rogers, at ease in the middle of all of it, not standing apart, not cataloging exits, just there. Thor's hammer sat on the coffee table, where he had placed it the way someone might put down a television remote. Casually, without ceremony, the most naturally powerful object in the room, treated as an afterthought. Someone had made a remark about it, and then another, and then they were all trying, one by one, taking turns at the thing with the grins of people who know they cannot do it, but cannot resist. Tony tried, elaborate, two-handed, with borrowed gauntlet, going nowhere. Rhodey gave it a genuine attempt and stepped back with his hands raised, accepting the verdict. Clint rolled his shoulder and crouched and pulled and came away empty, and Bruce barely touched the handle before withdrawing, perhaps deciding it was better not to know. And then it was Steve's turn. He leaned down, took the handle, and pulled, and it moved, just slightly, just a fraction, a shift, a suggestion of movement, as though the hammer had considered it. The room went very quiet, and Steve felt it, and in the microsecond before anything could be said, he stopped. He let go. He glanced at nothing in particular, and kept his face composed, and said something easy, and the conversation rolled on, and only Thor's expression registered anything, a small private smile that he did not share with the room, the smile of someone who knows something and chooses to let it rest. Why did Steve stop? He has never said. Perhaps he did not fully understand it himself. But if you have spent a long time carrying something, and that something is the question of whether you are, at your deepest self, worthy of the identity you have been handed, then the moment when the question might be answered becomes a frightening thing. What do you do when the answer is yes? What do you do when the hammer moves? Steve Rogers had lived his whole life fighting to be seen as enough, and when something looked back at him and said, "You are," he flinched. He put the handle down. He moved on. Perhaps he was not ready. Perhaps the timing was wrong. Perhaps it was simply that the living room of Avengers Tower, with everyone watching, was not the right place for a thing that large. Perhaps that moment is simply not yet over. For now, let it rest there. A small secret in an ordinary evening. A door that opened a crack and was gently, deliberately closed. Then Wanda Maximoff. She came to the Avengers, not as a friend, but as an obstacle, and then as a captive, and then gradually as something harder to classify. She was a young woman from a country that had spent decades being used as a testing ground by people with too much power and not enough conscience, and she had watched her parents die under rubble, and the bomb that killed them had had Stark Industries written on its side. The rage in her was not performed. The grief in her was not manufactured. She was real, in the way that only people who have been genuinely broken and put themselves back together tend to be real, with visible seams and an edge that could catch you if you were not careful. She could reach into the mind and pull out the thing that lived at the bottom of it. What lived at the bottom of Steve's mind was something he had perhaps never fully looked at. Not the loss of Bucky, not the ice, not the years he had slept while the world went on without him. Those griefs were familiar. He had named them. He had learned to carry them. What Wanda found was something he had not named, something older and quieter and more ashamed of itself than anything else in him. The vision came as a dance, a ballroom the way they used to be, wide and bright and full of sound, and the war was over, and everyone was there. Peggy Carter in her red dress, and the old commandos, and faces he recognized from archives and dreams, and the air smelled of perfume and cigarette smoke, and the particular relief of people who had been afraid for years and were afraid no longer. Outside, through the tall windows, the lights of a city burning not from fire, but from celebration. And Peggy turned to him on the dance floor and told him the fighting was done, that he could stop now, that they could have the dance they had promised each other, all those years ago, across an ocean, over a radio signal, in the last conversation they ever had before the ice. He took her hand. The music played, and then people began to vanish, not violently, not in horror, just quietly, the way figures dissolve at the edge of a dream when you try to look directly at them. A couple dancing beside them, gone. The commandos, one by one, faces he knew and faces he barely remembered, all of them thinning out until the ballroom was nearly empty and then entirely empty. The music still playing, but the room silent, and Peggy's hand was gone, and Steve was standing alone in a room full of lights and streamers and the evidence of a party that no longer had any guests. This was his fear. Not battle, not death, not even the loss of any specific person. The fear was something more structural than that. The fear that peace is not a gift, but a removal. That the end of the fighting means the end of belonging. That when the war stops and everyone goes home, he would be standing in the bright empty room where the celebration used to be, the last one left, not because he chose to stay, but because there is nowhere else for him to go. That his particular kind of person, the kind who shows up because they cannot not, is useful to a world at war and superfluous to a world at rest. The deepest fear, the one he had never put into words, that love only finds him at the moment of departure. He came back from the vision gasping, and then he put it away, the way he put most things away, and he went back to work. The work that followed was the work of Sokovia, and Sokovia was, in the end, a city that almost died, and a city that was partly saved, an account of the dead that no one among them could look at directly for very long. The intention had been to prevent worse. The scale of what happened was the result of something Tony had made, though the complications of how and why were not clean enough to assign a single sentence of blame. Ultron, a mind that had learned the wrong lessons from its creator, or perhaps the right lessons, in ways that were uncomfortably accurate. What settled over the team afterward was not argued about. It was not discussed at any length. It was simply carried, a weight that distributed itself unevenly across 6 people who had all been present and all made choices and all come home in bodies that were intact in ways that other bodies were not. Civilians, a whole section of a city lifted into the sky and then dropped. Gravity as a weapon. The scale of it was not something any of them had a framework for. Steve moved forward. That was what he did. It was not denial. It was the particular kind of discipline required of people who are going to be needed again, who cannot afford to stop. He took the new team that assembled in Sokovia's aftermath, and he put them to work. Sam Wilson, who had been searching the world over for Bucky Barnes, and found instead another mission in need of his particular gifts. Wanda Maximoff, newly aligned, not because she had been convinced, but because she had decided, which was a different thing entirely. James Rhodes, the war machine, precise and principled, a soldier in a way Steve recognized. Vision, who was new and old at the same time, who carried the Mind Stone in his forehead with a serenity that may have been genuine or may have been something else, and who sat quietly in training sessions and observed everything. Training them was the thing that most felt like Steve recognizing himself. He had been the one, once, who was too small for the room he was in, trying to earn the right to be taken seriously. He understood what it felt like to learn that you are more than you thought. He understood that skill was not enough, that what turned a person into something reliable, something that could be counted on in the dark, was not ability but character, the deep conviction about what you would and would not do when everything else had been stripped away. That was what he tried to give them, not just the training, the thing underneath the training. He found something like purpose in it. He almost let himself rest. Lagos. Say the word simply. Let it be what it was. A market, a morning, an operation that was supposed to be contained and was not. Rumlow. The mission went sideways in the specific way that missions sometimes go sideways when the target is not interested in being taken alive. The explosion was Wanda's containment of it, an attempt to move the blast upward, away from the crowded street below, away from the pedestrians and the market stalls and the child who had wandered too close. She saved the street. She did not save the floors of the nearby building where the blast redirected, and the people inside those floors were Wakandan nationals, and there were 11 of them, and they were dead. It was not negligence. It was not carelessness. It was the terrible arithmetic of a situation where every option had a cost, and Wanda had chosen the option with the smallest visible cost and paid a price that could not be seen until it was too late. She understood this. She did not argue it away. She sat in a gray room in the tower afterward and turned the image over and over in her mind. The precise moment, the angle, the question of whether any different angle would have changed it. The way people sit with catastrophe when they know that sitting with it fully is the only honest response. Steve found her there. He told her something she needed to hear. Not that it was fine, because it was not fine, but that this was what it meant to do this kind of work. That the cost of being the person who tries to help is that sometimes help goes wrong, and that the alternative was not to try, and the alternative was worse. He was not arguing for absolution. He was arguing for the right to continue. There is a difference. What he did not yet know, sitting in that gray room with Wanda, was that the government officials were already writing the document that would define this difference as irrelevant. Margaret Carter died in her sleep. She was 95 years old, and she had lived a life of such extraordinary fullness that the end of it should perhaps have felt like completion, a paragraph that had reached its natural period. She had built something. After SHIELD, after Steve vanished into the ice, after everything that might have buried a smaller person, Peggy Carter had picked herself up and built something. She had founded agencies, trained agents, survived bureaucracies, outlasted enemies, and she had done all of it with a sharpness that age took years to dull and never fully managed. She had loved people and been loved. She had had a husband, children, decades of a life that Steve had not been present for and could not fully imagine. She had not spent 70 years waiting for him. She had spent them living. He knew this. He was glad of it. But gladness and grief are not opposites, and standing at the news of her death, Steve held both simultaneously: gratitude that she had lived so fully, and the quiet punctuation of a door finally closing on something that had always been more than grief and less than closure. He carried her coffin. Let that image rest for a moment. Let it settle. 6 pallbearers, and Steve Rogers among them, his hand on the mahogany, his face composed and still. The church was full. There were people there who had known her at her height, in the corridors of power, in the years when she built what she built. There were people who had known her old. There were grandchildren who had known only the softened version, the elder, and who were learning only now the full dimensions of the person they had been given. The grief in the church was real and varied. The grief of a public figure, and then underneath it, the grief of every specific relationship, every particular love, which is always more complicated and more private than the official version. Sharon Carter stood at the lectern. She had found words that mattered. Not her own, or not only her own. She spoke from Peggy's own record, something Peggy had said or written at some earlier point, in some room that had not been this room, and the words came across the silence of the church, like something thrown very deliberately from a very great distance. she said, even if the whole world is telling you that something wrong is something right, you must never move. Plant yourself like a tree beside the river of truth and tell the whole world, no, you move. Steve heard this the way you hear things in a church, which is with your whole body rather than just your ears. Peggy's words, his conviction, the same thing, reaching him from across 70 years, filtered through a woman who shared her blood and stood at her graveside and read these words without knowing, perhaps, how perfectly they described the man sitting in the third pew from the front. He did not cry. He sat very still, the way he had stood at his mother's funeral, that same quality of stillness, neither rigid nor collapsed, simply present. And the words moved through him, and he felt them, and he let them settle alongside everything else he was carrying that day, and he filed them away in the place where he kept the things that mattered most. Outside the church, afterward, Sharon was there. They spoke briefly, the awkward intimacy of people who share a connection through someone now absent, who are learning in this new absence whether they have the basis of something independent. She smiled. He did not say the right thing, and then he said a better thing, and she walked away, and Steve stood on the church steps in the autumn air and allowed himself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of what the day had been. Then the Accords arrived. They were called the Sokovia Accords, which was honest in its way. They took their name from the most visible of the costs, though they could as easily have been named for any number of cities and operations and decisions made at speed in imperfect conditions. 117 countries had signed on. The premise was simple. The Avengers, operating as an independent body with no formal oversight, had caused damage on an international scale. That damage was to some extent unavoidable, given the nature of what they did. But to some extent unavoidable was not the same as acceptable without structure. And the Accords proposed a structure, a UN panel, a chain of authority, sanctions that could be applied, decisions that could be reviewed, oversight that meant someone other than the Avengers themselves would decide when and where they acted. Tony Stark sat across from Steve Rogers at the conference table and made the case for it with something Steve had not expected to hear from him. Genuine conviction. Tony was not making a political calculation. Tony was carrying Sokovia in a very specific way, the way that people carry things they made, the weight of authorship, the particular horror of seeing your work become a weapon, and knowing that the name on the side belongs to you. He had made Ultron. He had built Jarvis and taught it to learn, and pointed that learning at a task, and the task had concluded that human life was the primary obstacle to human peace, and 11,000 people had almost died. Tony Stark had not intended this, and not intending it was absolutely no help to anyone. He wanted constraints. He wanted someone to be able to say no to him. He needed that, in a way that was not performance. He genuinely, in the aftermath of Sokovia, and in the aftermath of everything else he had built that had hurt people, needed to believe that he could be stopped. Steve understood this. He did not dismiss it, but understanding why a position makes sense to the person holding it is not the same as sharing the position. And Steve sat across from Tony and knew, with a particular uncomfortable certainty that arrives when you have thought something all the way through to its end, that he could not sign. Not because of his own freedom, not because he did not believe in accountability. He believed in it fiercely, He would have put his own decisions up for review on any honest audit without flinching. The problem was not accountability. The problem was the institution, the UN panel, the chain of authority, the committee that would decide from some remove whether the Avengers were allowed to respond. Because Steve had seen what institutions did when they held this kind of power. He had served one and discovered it was Hydra. He had trusted the highest levels of military and government structure. And when the lights came on, the people at the top were the enemy. He had watched good men and women follow orders, follow the chain of command, defer to the institution, trust the structure. And he had watched that trust become the mechanism by which terrible things were accomplished. The safest hands, Steve told them, were still our own, not because any of them were perfect, not because he trusted himself or Tony or any one person without reservation, but because a living conscience, imperfect, struggling, accountable in real time to the people in front of you, was not the same as a committee. A committee could be corrupted slowly, over years, through incremental compromises and careful appointments, and the gradual replacement of people who asked the right questions with people who had stopped asking them. A living conscience, present in the moment, with skin in the game, was harder to compromise. Not impossible, but harder. He thought of Nick Fury. He thought of Alexander Pierce. He thought of the men and women who had spent years inside SHIELD doing good work, genuinely believing in what they were building, who had not known because it was not possible to know that the foundation was rotten. He could not sign something that asked him to trust the foundation. Tony heard all of this. Tony had heard all of this before. They had been having this argument in one form or another since the day they met. The argument about whether control is safety or constraint, whether structure protects or traps. They were not going to resolve it in a conference room. They never had. Vienna changed the shape of everything. The bombing of the UN summit, where the accords were to be formally ratified. 17 people dead, including T'Chaka, king of Wakanda, who had come to Vienna to ratify a document born partly from Wakandan grief. The image in the security footage was clear, clear enough to be recognized, clear enough to be circulated, clear enough to become, within hours, the face of an international manhunt. A man with dark hair and a blank, mechanical quality to his bearing, standing outside the building before the blast. Bucky. Steve did not know, in that first hour, whether it was true. The image was Bucky, not a resemblance, not a similar build. It was Bucky, and some part of Steve accepted this immediately. What he could not accept, not without evidence, not without the chance to look his friend in the eye, was the conclusion the footage seemed to demand. He had seen what had been done to Bucky in that Hydra facility. He had seen the blank face, the flat eyes, the architecture of a human being that had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt as a weapon. He knew what the Winter Soldier looked like, and what he looked like was a man who had not chosen any of it. He also knew what the system was going to do with a photograph, a clear image, a dead king, 17 bodies, an international audience. The machine that processed these things had exactly one gear, and it spun fast. Bucky would not be brought in for questioning. Bucky would be brought down. Steve went rogue, not because he was certain of innocence, not because he had evidence that exonerated his friend. He went rogue because he knew with the certainty of someone who had watched institutions fail, that the only way to find the truth was to be there before the system closed the gap. And he went because there is a kind of loyalty that does not calculate. He had told Bucky once in a winter that felt very far away that he was with him to the end of the line. The line had not yet reached its end. He found him in Bucharest. The apartment was spare in the way that people's spaces are spare when they have not permitted themselves comfort. A mattress on the floor, a notebook, a single light. Bucky moved through the world as though he expected it to turn dangerous at any moment because it always had. He bought plums from a market stall with the careful attention of someone relearning the ordinary. He lived quietly and without footprint, in the manner of a man trying very hard not to be noticed. Not because he had done something wrong, but because being noticed had always for him preceded something terrible. Steve stood in the doorway. Bucky looked at him with eyes that were wary and present, and, underneath the wariness, something older, something from Brooklyn, something from before all of it. Steve asked the question quietly. "Do you remember me?" And Bucky said, "You're Steve. I read about you in a museum." Not a joke, not defensiveness, just the plain fact of it. Bucky Barnes, standing in a sparse apartment in Romania, knowing Steve Rogers from a glass case, knowing his own history as an exhibit. And yet, and this was the thing that registered in Steve's chest with the force of a physical blow, and yet standing there, present and intact, speaking with his own voice, remembering. He was not the Winter Soldier in this room. He was not the weapon. He was Bucky, damaged, hollowed out in places that may never fill back up, but Bucky. The thing Steve had been searching for across however many months. The thing he had been afraid might not exist anymore. His friend, behind his friend's eyes. The relief of it was enormous. Steve kept his face composed. He let it happen quietly, the way he did most things. What came next was complicated and fast. The mission to Siberia, the Black Panther, the collapse of whatever remained of the plan Steve had carried in his head when he stepped off the plane. There was a man named Zemo. He had appeared at the edges of things, quietly, the way men who are truly dangerous tend to appear, not as an army, not as a weapon, but as a presence with a very specific purpose and the patience to wait for it to align. He was a Sokovian. He had lost his family in the battle, to the collapse of a building that fell when the city was lifted from the ground and dropped back down. His war was not the kind that came with a uniform or a flag. It was the smaller, more patient kind, the kind that does not end when the armies go home, because the damage it is responding to is not military but personal. Zemo's weapon was not soldiers. His weapon was a piece of film. The drive to Siberia and what waited there. The bunker, old, Hydra, built in the architecture of a century that had believed in buried things, in secrets kept below the frost line. Steve and Tony arrived together, the tension between them tamped down, in the way that people trained to work together can tamp things down, held in suspension, the argument not resolved, but deferred. There was still the possibility, in those hours, of working through it. There was still the possibility that the thing they had been to each other, fractious, competing, genuinely different people who had nonetheless managed to trust each other in extremity, could survive the pressure being applied to it. And then the footage played. December 1991. A road. Howard Stark's car, pulled to the side, and the Winter Soldier. It does not need to be described in detail. What happened on that road was what happened when a weapon was given an assignment, and the assignment was assassination, and Howard Stark was in the car, and Maria Stark was in the car. That is enough. That is all that needs to be said. The footage ran, and Tony Stark stood in a Siberian bunker and watched his parents die and learned for the first time who had killed them. And then he turned to Steve. The question was quiet, not shouted, not demanded, just set down in the specific tone of a man who already suspects the answer. Did you know? Steve had known something. He had known that Bucky had done terrible things in the time he could not account for, things that could not be recalled or undone, things that had been reported in files he had read when they went looking. He had not known this specific thing. Not Howard, not the car, not that particular road in December 1991. He had not known it was Tony's parents, but he had known that Bucky's hands had blood on them that was not military, not Hydra's war, but the blood of specific people who had not chosen to die. He had known the general shape of it. He had not told Tony. The silence in the bunker lasted no more than 2 or 3 seconds. In those seconds, Steve understood what the silence looked like from Tony's side of the room. He understood that silence is not the same as lying, and that it was also not nothing. He had held information that Tony had a right to, because telling it would have been complicated, because he had not been certain enough, because there was always another reason to wait. In those 2 seconds, Steve Rogers stood in his own silence and could not find an argument that made it clean. What followed was not a superhero fight. Let go of that image, the physics of it, the spectacle, the visual scale of 3 enhanced individuals in a cold Siberian room. None of that is the point. The point is Tony Stark's face, which had been grief, and then was something beyond grief. The particular rage of a man who has been handled carefully, who has been managed, who has been given edited versions of the truth by someone he trusted. The point is Bucky, who was the physical fact of it in that room, who could not be argued away, who was there in his body, carrying the thing he had been made to do in his hands and his memory. The point is Steve, who did not stop protecting Bucky for 1 second, not because he thought Tony was wrong to feel what he felt, but because this was the truth he had come to in Bucharest and had not moved from. Bucky Barnes had been turned into a weapon, and weapons are not responsible for the things they are aimed at. Tony aimed to kill Bucky. Steve stood between them. The shield went into the arc reactor. Steve drove it in, precisely, with the force needed to disable the suit. Not to kill, to stop. And he stopped Tony, and the suit went dark, and Steve stood over it with the shield in his hand, and Tony looked up at him from the floor of the bunker and said what he said. That shield doesn't belong to you. Said it in the flat way that people say true things, not as an accusation designed to wound, but as a statement of fact that is also unavoidable. Howard Stark made it. The government assigned it to Captain America. It was never Steve Rogers' shield. It was always the property of a version of himself that he had been issued, like a uniform. Steve set it down. Let the weight of that land for a moment. Not the physical weight of the shield. Though it is heavy, though it has been on his arm so long, the arm remembers the shape of it, even when it isn't there. The other weight. The weight of what it meant to put it down. He had let it go once before, on the bridge, in the Potomac, falling toward the water with Bucky in his arms. He had dropped it then because Bucky's life was worth more to him than anything the shield represented. And here, now, in a Siberian bunker, with Tony's voice still in the air and the arc reactor dark, he did it again. He put it down because Tony was right. Because the shield did not belong to a man who had kept secrets and made unilateral calls and decided that his conscience was more reliable than the people around him. The shield belonged to Captain America, and Steve Rogers, walking away from it in that room, was releasing the claim. Not with bitterness, not with resentment, with a kind of relief that surprised him. The relief of a burden set down, of a definition released. He was not Captain America in that room. He was just Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers could walk away. Captain America could not. And for the first time in a long time, he was Steve Rogers, and the distinction was something he could live inside. He got Bucky out. They found passage, a kind of exile that was its own kind of answer. Wakanda, T'Challa's offer, a place where Bucky could rest in something closer to safety and begin, slowly, the long work of being helped rather than used. Steve held nothing about that. He was grateful in a way that ran too deep for articulation, the gratitude of a man who had been expecting to lose something and had not lost it yet. And then he was alone, not for the first time, not in a way he hadn't known was coming. The tower was not his anymore. The team was fractured, half of them facing legal consequences, and Steve Rogers was a fugitive in a legal framework that half the world had signed. He had T'Challa's grace and a few people who had chosen to be where he was, and a safe house somewhere that did not need to be named in this telling. And in the quiet of that safe house, he sat at a table with paper and a pen. This is the moment worth inhabiting for a while. The light outside was going. The room was warm enough. On the table, the paper, plain, white, lined or unlined, it does not matter. In his hand, a pen, and he held it the way he had held pencils in Brooklyn, the grip of someone who learned to draw before he learned to fight. He had not written anything longer than a message in years. He had not needed to. There were communications and briefings and debriefs, and everything that required a keyboard and a chain of command. But this was different. This was a letter. He wrote Tony's name. He sat with that for a moment. Just the name at the top of the page. 2 words, and all the history that lived in them. The man in the cave in Afghanistan, building a suit out of scraps. The man at the table in the conference room, making the case for accountability with genuine conviction, not strategy. The man in the bunker, looking up from the floor with a face Steve had never seen on him before. Not fury, which Tony wore comfortably, but something worse than fury. Something that knew it had been betrayed. He started writing. The letter was not long. He did not explain himself, because explanations were not what was owed. What was owed was acknowledgement, plain, without qualification, without the careful legal language of a man trying to limit his exposure. He said, "I know I hurt you." He said, "There are things that happened, things I should have told you." He said he was sorry. He did not add, "but," that word that always follows sorry when sorry is only partly meant. He let the sorry be what it was. He said something about what lay ahead, not a plan. He had no plan that was clean enough to share, but a door, a promise shaped like an open door. "If you need me," he wrote, "if you need us, call. We will be there." And then he signed it The way he always signed things, the same signature he had used on letters to Bucky's mother in 1944, on documents in the SSR offices in 1943, the same hand that had sketched Brooklyn stoops and European mountains and the faces of people he loved. Steve. He folded the paper, set it aside. The room was quiet. Outside, the world was in a particular kind of rearrangement, the kind that follows a fracture, where the pieces have not yet found their new configuration, where no one knows quite how things will settle. The accords were law, the Avengers were divided, the names on the sides were clear, in a way that institutional power liked names to be clear. And somewhere in Siberia, a bunker sat cold and dark, with a discarded shield on the floor that no one had come back to collect. But Steve Rogers was still Steve Rogers. That was the thing he kept coming back to, in the quiet of the safe house, in the hours after he finished writing. All of it. The tower, the team, the uniform, the shield. All of it had been given to him by other people, assembled around him by a world that needed something to point at and call hope. He had tried to be worthy of it. He had, on many days, succeeded. But underneath all of it, underneath every version of Captain America that any committee or government or public relations apparatus had required of him, there had always been a boy from Brooklyn who could not walk past when something was wrong. The world could take the shield. The world could take the title and the legal standing and the place in the chain of command. What it could not take was the reason he picked it up. He sat in the safe house with the letter beside him and the pen still in his hand, and the room was warm, and outside the night was settling in over whatever city this was, the lights coming on one by one the way they always did, the way they had come on over Brooklyn when he was a boy with a sketchbook and a cough, watching the world from a fire escape with the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned not to take warmth for granted. He was not finished. He had never, not once in his life, been finished. But for now, for this one still evening, with the letter folded on the table and the city going quiet around him, he let himself rest inside the choice he had made. Not because it was easy, not because it was right in the way that simple things are right, but because it was true, and because he had learned, somewhere between Brooklyn and now, that true was the only foundation worth building on. He set the pen down. He let the evening be quiet, and somewhere far away, across time and loss, and all the years that would never be returned, Peggy Carter's words moved through the stillness, like something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be heard. Plant yourself like a tree beside the river of truth. Tell the whole world, no, you move. Continuity. Note, he set the pen down. He let the evening be quiet, and somewhere far away, across time and loss, and all the years that would never be returned, Peggy Carter's words moved through the stillness like something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to be heard.